So I kind of jumped the gun just because I was getting started late and I just wanted to get started. And then I'm like, I'm starting a new book, God is Red, and I don't want to start that off my time. I said I was going to be here at noon. I don't want to start a book early, all right? So I'm going to just leave it running and I'm looking to see if I pause this or just doesn't, you can't tell if it's paused or not. Okay, I guess I'm not paused. I don't know. That's a scary thing for recording. Anyway, I said I was going to get on here at noon. I'm going to get on here at noon to start reading. All right. So there are my classroom today. Those are my resources I used. And I'll be back here in 2 minutes. So I don't start the book early. Our new book, God is Red. We're ready to get started. I've got my little shawl on so I can curl up with a good book with you. Starting our new book, God is Red. I figured it out. I'm sorry. Like his name is probably Vinny. He's like, like the name is Vinny. Stop calling me Vine. I can't even do an Italian accent anymore. Oh, I'm pathetic. That's okay. We're getting started with a not so pathetic book, God is Red. Chapter 1, The Indian Movement. We are at war with the United States, Vernon Bellecourt cried, to your stations. In 1972, as Indian protesters rushed into the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters building in the nation's capital. Washington policemen prepared for a siege and the first dramatic confrontation between American Indians and the federal government in more than a century began. Oh, I literally have goosebumps. I'll try not to do that throughout. not have goosebumps, but stop. During the fall of 1972, there were continual complaints by American Indians about a number of shootings in Indian country in which Indians had been murdered without reason. 1972. Local officials did their best to cover up the incidents, and when the Indians appealed to the federal government for redress, they met with study delays and deaf ears. So in early October, a caravan known as the Trail of Broken Treaties had been formed. Coming initially from Seattle and Los Angeles, automobile caravans filled the Indian protesters winding their way toward the nation's capital, visited with different reservations along the route, and picked up more protesters at each stop. Rallies were held on the larger reservations where the grievances of a century were recited by the reservation residents. Tribal officials, fearful that their favored status as Interior Department mascots would be jeopardized, hastily began to downgrade the importance of the protest, implying that it was primarily a movement of urban Indians who had no relationship with the tribal community. Yet a considerable number of reservation people joined the caravan, so that by the time it reached Washington, D.C., more than 80% of the participants were reservation residents. The trouble began when the protesters discovered that no food and lodging provisions had been made for the stay in Washington. The advance men, who were supposed to have made room and board arrangements, actually spent their time making pronouncements and speaking to groups instead of doing the tedious and unromantic jobs of locating churches, hotels, and dormitories for the caravan participants. The interior officials were astounded to learn that there was no lodging available to the protesters, since the advance men had assured them that everything had been taken care of. During a conference in the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, the government officials offered to find a lodging place for the protesters as a ploy for getting them to leave the building's immediate vicinity. Participants began to gather in the auditorium of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to wait for final word on their disposition for the night, and when some government building guards began to push some of the younger protesters around, fear of violence spread through the building. People were reluctant to leave, thinking that they would immediately be arrested or worse by the police waiting outside. When word came to the people quietly waiting in the auditorium, the police guards had clashed with some of the protesters near one of the doors. The tension broke. The Indians sealed off the Bureau building, taking control of every door and window that could possibly be used by the police to enter. The building was taken over by the Trail of Broken Treaties protesters on Friday night, November 3rd, 1972, the weekend before the presidential elections. Government negotiations began almost immediately and continued through the weekend. Indian leaders promised to vacate the building, but continuous threats of violence from the police surrounding the building held the invaders in a viral state of panic. The invasion by the police seemed imminent. Desks and files were randomly piled against outside doors and windows in an effort to defend the building. Does that sound like January 6th to you or what? During the weekend, some of the Indians attempted to go to Arlington Cemetery to hold religious services for fallen Indian war dead, particularly Ira Hayes, hero of Iwo Jima, and Sergeant Ernest Rice, a Winnebago hero of the Korean War, who was buried in Arlington when the police of Iowa refused to allow his burial in a white cemetery in Sioux City. The caravan people went to federal court hoping to have reversed the U.S. Army order that banned the protesters from the National Cemetery on the basis that they constituted a partisan political group. But the tension between the Indians and the government were so high by the time the court ruled in their favor on Monday that few caravan members bothered to go to the service. Most of them remained within the building, hoping to protect the caravan's elderly and children. On November 9th, nearly a full week after occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, the Trail of Broken Treaties Indians left Washington. During that time, the protesters removed numerous government records and files as hostage material to ensure a peaceful departure. Capitol Police eschewed the brutality practiced on other occasions rather than risk a retaliatory burning and destruction of government files. The protesters scattered and returned to their reservations, leaving the nation shocked and dismayed. According to stories in the Washington Post, the damage to the building was $2.3 million, a figure that the newspaper said was exceeded only by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire and the burning of Washington by the British during the War of 1812. In the history of destruction of federal property, the Trail of Broken Treaties protest was given a respectable third place. Later testimony before the House Subcommittee on Indian Affairs placed the actual damage as something more than a couple of $1,000, and the figure continued to decline as more specific knowledge was gained about what had actually been destroyed. In the wake of the destruction, even moderate and sympathetic Indians were dismayed by the activist actions. The Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters had contained priceless objects of Indian art, including paintings by Indians of notable stature now deceased. The activists hardly gave a thought to preserving Indian cultural treasures. Their fear of violence was so intense that they simply chose whatever was at hand to use in the barricades. From Assy Blue Eagle's irreplaceable paintings to the urinals in the men's room, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was destroyed. Elected tribal officials were brought to Washington, where Robert Robertson, director of the Vice President's National Council of Indian Opportunity, orchestrated their protests and demands for the prosecution of the protest leaders. The fact that the tribal chairmen were little more than puppets in Robertson's hand negated much of their impact in Indian country, but the rage and concern of Indians across the nation was evident. At best, the lofty moral stance of the American Indian community lay in ruins. Indians were no longer the silent, peaceful individuals who refused to take dramatic steps to symbolize their grievances. They had become simply another protest group. The capture of the headquarters by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, by the Indians of the Trail of Broken Treaties caravan, was the climactic event of a movement that had remained for the most part on the back pages of the nation's newspapers. For nearly a decade, the Indian people's frustration and rage had been rising, but in most cases in which the movement was reported, it was considered a pleasant respite from the fury, confusion, and threats of the blacks and Chicanos. The message of the American Indian, a recital of broken promises and loss of sacred lands, never reached the public in a form making it possible to capitalize on the outpouring of goodwill that the American public held for American Indians. This public had heard Indian complaints about broken treaties and confiscation of sacred mountains for years. But what did it matter? The public was confused at almost every turn. What could be done about a broken treaty now? Most Americans thought that the respective tribes' problems were facts of American history, not problems of the present. There was no outpouring of assistance for Indians comparable to the frenzy that gripped the North at the height of the civil rights movement. Throughout the last decade, Indian activists chose, sometimes cleverly and sometimes stupidly, symbols that they believed would convey the importance of their land and religions to the rest of America. One of them was the pollution one. That was a good one. In a nation where few people had ever questioned the superiority of Anglo-Saxon and Christian values, the Indians' emphasis on land and religion seemed an anachronistic fantasy of the American frontier. Fantasy, absolutely. Many people applauded the Indian activists, but it is doubtful if very many understood them. Even the greatest success of the last century, the restoration of the sacred Blue Lake area to the people of, I think it's Dos Pueblo in New Mexico, failed to achieve any significance in the general populace's worldview. In the Blue Lake controversy, the whole distinction between Indians and non-Indians could have been seen if anyone had been interested. Theodore Roosevelt, on a great conservation trip in 1906, decided that the timberlands in northern New Mexico should be placed in a national forest for their protection. Carson National Forest was created by executive order, and when the government surveyors had finished laying out the boundaries, the sacred Blue Lake, central to the practice of Pueblo religion, was safely within the forest. The people of the Pueblo immediately petitioned the government for the lake's restoration. They explained that it was their major religious shrine and that the Pueblo would die without its sanctuary for the perpetuation of its religion. The Interior Department sided with the Pueblo in 1912, supporting a return to the lake to them. Excuse me, sorry. The Department of Agriculture, however, had other ideas. Department of Agriculture, let's not forget. It considered the forest the personal property of the Secretary of Agriculture and refused to allow the lands to be restored. The valuable timber that grew on the slopes of Blue Lake was an incentive to the officials in the Department of Agriculture to keep the area. They saw their task as keeping the area safely away from the rest of American society until the timber companies were ready to use it. And in that way, they could assure themselves of a powerful outside constituency at appropriations time, thus guaranteeing their continuance as a governing agency. The struggle continued for a period of 64 years without the Agricultural Department budging the slightest inch in its position. After the Second World War, it appeared as though the battle had been won by agriculture. Clinton P. Anderson, conservative Democrat from New Mexico, served first as Secretary of Agriculture from 1945 to 1948, and then as U.S. Senator from New Mexico on the Senate's Interior Committee. In due time, Anderson, who would come to Washington in the 1930s as a youngster and friend of Lyndon B. Johnson and the New Deal power structure, achieved a prominent place in the Interior Committee and substantial influence in Congress. Since any Indian legislation to return Blue Lake had to go through the Interior Committee, the fight was regarded as over. In 1965, the Indian Claims Commission heard the claims of the Taos Indians against the United States. The commissioners admitted that the United States had illegally taken the Blue Lake area and offered a substantial sum as compensation. The commissioners were astounded when the Indians refused the money. They wanted the Blue Lake area returned to them. If the commission would not do that, the Indians did not want it, said that said that they had sold their sacred shrine. They told the commission that they would refuse the compensation. It seems that for someone in America to turn down $1 was unusual when it was a little group of Indians living on the edge of starvation. It presented a more profound and difficult moral question than is usually raised in government circles. The Indian Claims Commission agreed to settle the remainder of the case without making any decision on Blue Lake, while the Pueblo went to Congress to see if they could get the lands restored. Led by Paul Bernal, a spokesman for the Taos Indians, the movement to restore Blue Lake to the Pueblo began in 1965. Paul traveled across the nation many times, speaking to groups and urging them to contact their senators and congressmen to demand support for the bill to restore the lake to the Indians. A groundswell gradually built. One by one, the senators on the Interior Committee began to break their united front. Other congressmen began to take interest in the restoration as the persistent Taos spokesman refused to accept a series of compromises offered by Clinton Anderson in an effort to still the movement. And don't think we don't have a convenient change of names and languages throughout history like we've seen. Although making a claim to whatever you had seems to be legally much more difficult. Clinton Anderson. Is there a P there? For you're full of shit. In November of 1970, President Nixon took a hand in the matter, and the White House began to apply pressure on its friends in Congress to get Blue Lake returned to the Taos people. The extent of the national support Bernal had generated can be understood by the entrance of Richard Nixon into the controversy. If the movement was so politically strong as to entice President Nixon to take sides, it had to be a winning hand. The Senate Interior Committee still had major anti-Indian personalities on it. However, in the Democratic lineup of Chairman Henry Jackson, Clinton Anderson, Lee Metcalf, and Alan Bible, Anderson steered his compromise bill to give what basically amounted to a continued use permit to the Pueblo, dependent on the goodwill of the Forest Service. The Senate Interior Committee amended the House of Representatives bill, which allowed the Pueblo to take the land in trust. When the compromise bill hit the Senate floor, Senators Fred Harris and Robert Griffin offered a bipartisan amendment to the Anderson Compromise. The surprises in voting underscored the effectiveness of the Indian lobbyists. The voting also showed that many of the senators had been hiding under liberal and conservative labels and were forced to come out into the open on the vote. Frank Church, until then regarded as an Indian enemy, voted with the Indians. Barry Goldwater, generally chastised for his dogged conservatism, also supported Taos. Lee Metcalf and Henry Jackson, regarded as liberals, bitterly opposed the Indians. Metcalf going so far as to deride the Indian religion on the Senate floor, trying to stop the amendment. In December 1970, President Nixon signed into law the bill that restored 44,000 acres surrounding the sacred Blue Lake to the people of the Taos Pueblo. The significance of the law could not be underestimated. It was the first clear sign, as Senator Charles Percy noted in his speech on the bill, that the Indian religious practices would be given equal respect along with Christian ceremonies. Remembering the Blue Lake fight, let us examine the approximate chronology of the recent Indian activist incidents and review the issues raised in each demonstration. Present in all of them, we shall find something of the same integrating force, the same desire of communal integrity exemplified in the Blue Lake struggle. A great many small and sporadic events were crowded into the last decade of the Indian movement, but the year 1969 probably marks the beginning of the massive and sustained drive by American Indians to bring their message to the American public. Leading into 1969 was the famous confrontation between the Mohawks of Canada and the Canadian officials at the Cornwall, Ontario Bridge linking Canada to the United States. In 1968, the Canadian officials began to demand that the Mohawks pay tolls to use the bridge and customs on the goods brought back from the United States. This move by Canada violated a series of treaties and agreements with the Indians of North America, originally made by Great Britain, the oldest and most specific of which was Jay's Treaty in 1794 between the United States and Great Britain. On December 18, 1968, the Mohawks, featuring Tanetta Horn, former actress and model and confidant of Dick Cavett, blockaded Cornwall Bridge as a means of forcing the issue of tolls and customs payments. Canadian police rushed onto the bridge and arrested the Indians. When the case came to trial in late March 1969, the travesty of Canadian justice became clear. Tanetta Horn was charged with obstructing 10 police officers. It was patently obvious that one little Indian girl could not have obstructed so many large policemen, so that the police in the courtroom began to laugh. As their laughter reached a crescendo, the prosecutor admitted that he had not read the charges before coming into the courtroom. He had to ask for a recess to see what the Indians were to be charged. Upon returning, the prosecutor promptly announced that Miss Horn was being charged with having an offensive weapon that she had intended to use against police. It turns out that the alleged offensive weapon used by Miss Horn was a small knife, more on the order of a fingernail file than a scimitar. The charges against her were dropped. The issue of the treaty was not so easily disposed of, since the evidence introduced at the trial indicated that not only was the 1994 treaty still valid, but that in 1933 the Cornwall Northern New York Bridge Company had paid the Mohawks $798 for the land upon which the bridge was built. The agreement included the right to pass freely over the bridge under essentially the same terms as originally described in Jay's Treaty. The question of an illegal demonstration was quickly foreclosed by the Canadian court for fear that the liability of the Canadian government for other offenses would be shown. For example, the Indians and probably the Canadian officials knew that the Iroquois had valid title to about 85% of the lands of Ontario. This must be where I read about Oakland County. With this partially successful effort to get Canada to abide by the 1794 treaty and the 1933 agreement, the modern Indian movement can be said to have gotten off to an energetic, if somewhat humorous, start. The Mohawks' objection, voiced then and since, is that Jay Treaty means that the international boundary does not apply to the Mohawk settlements, which are partially in Canada and partially in the United States. If the border is recognized by law, then the Mohawks become citizens of both Canada and the United States. If the border is not recognized, the Mohawks are a nation with international status. Pressure began to build in Indian country following the Cornwall Bridge incident. One of the major eruptions occurred later that summer at the Gallup, New Mexico ceremonial. A number of young Navajos passed out a mimeograph statement denouncing the festivities of basically dominated by the Chamber of Commerce, whites, and derided by their interest in Indians. Gallup, New Mexico is a study in contrast. It proudly brags that it is the Indian capital of the world, yet nowhere in the world are Indians more systematically brutalized than in Gallup. It is estimated that from 50 to 72% of the business done by white businessmen derives from the Indians. As a commercial center, the town is almost totally dependent on its Indian trade. The town power structure, however, does virtually nothing for the Indians who come to Gallup except take their money. The town's sole accomplishment to date is nearly destroying the Gallup Indian Center by firing Herb Blatchford, the Navajo, who laboriously built the center after it had been bankrupted by white directors in the early 1960s. On August 16, 1969, at the height of the annual Chamber of Commerce festivities known as the Gallup Ceremonial, Michael Benson, June Tracy, and Linda Hubbard, all teenaged Navajo, passed out their leaflets at the center of the ceremonial grounds. Their mimeoed sheet was entitled, "When Our Grandfathers Had Guns." It presented a fairly accurate picture of the treatment Indians received in Gallup. It refuted the publicity releases issued by the white businessmen who controlled the ceremonial that presented the Indians seen by tourists in Gallup during the ceremonial as a happy people. The town fathers were livid. The three young people were denied permission to pass out the leaflets and escorted from the ceremonial grounds. The reaction of the Gallup businessmen supported the contentions of the young Navajos better than any other evidence they could have mustered. Not only were the young people systematically harassed by townspeople, but the incident was made part of an ongoing campaign to destroy the Gallup Indian Center by economic and political pressures. The point of the leaflet, the reduction of Navajo and Zuni Indians in a state of perpetual drunkenness by harassment and discrimination by the white businessmen of Gallup, was never mentioned. In the Pacific Northwest, things were getting no better. The Quinaults of the western part of Washington had repeatedly pleaded with the non-Indians using their beaches to refrain from littering the shorelands. The tribe owns 29 miles of beach on the Pacific coast, and it has been kept relatively primitive for most of the century. It may be the last long stretch of clean beach left on the west coast. But the whites continued to litter the beach. They stole or destroyed Indian fishing nets, hung out to dry, removed large quantities of driftwood, which in many instances had solidified the coastline from erosion, and defaced some of the prominent and famous landmarks along the beach by painting school numerals and so forth. Hoping to correct the most blatant practices, the tribal council invoked its zoning powers against the intruders and closed the beaches to everyone except tribal members. The outcry of the whites in Washington was incredible. They completely lost sight of the issues of littering, property destruction, and landmark defacement, accusing the tribe of being selfish for wanting to close the beaches. Although the beaches were tribal property, they seemed to feel that they had a right to use them for their own purposes. Appeals were made to the governor of the state to institute legal proceedings against the tribe to force them to reopen the beaches or to seek federal aid in taking away the tribe's power to control access to its own beaches. The Quinaults held their ground, puzzled that people who talked boldly about conservation and ecology would want to ensure deliberate destruction of the state's last remaining stretch of good beach. Attorney General Slade Gorton of Washington, in defiance of existing federal law, precluded tribal affairs from state laws, and he did not think that the tribe had the unchallenged right to exclusive control of the beaches. The state officials were so short-sighted as to believe that no conservation issues were involved and that the Quinaults were merely trying to make trouble. The state finally backed off. It would have been ridiculous to have gone into the federal courts in an effort to force the tribe to allow whites to litter the beaches in the face of overwhelming evidence of perpetrated damages. The beaches remained closed. The beach closure struck directly at the heart of the Indian-white relationship in the same way that the Taos Blue Lake controversy had done. The Quinaults viewed their beach as an intimate part of their communal existence. They were determined not to tolerate its senseless destruction. While not as specifically a religious shrine like Blue Lake, the beaches of the Quinault nonetheless conveyed a tremendous spiritual quality to the people. During the Blue Lake struggle, the Pueblo people were often violently opposed by the conservation groups, which charged that the Indians would pollute the lake if it was restored to them. But these groups were strangely silent with respect to Quinault beaches, strangely quiet. The major event of 1969, of course, was the occupation of Alcatraz Island in November. Shortly after the island was closed as a prison in 1964, a number of Sioux Indians then living in the San Francisco Bay Area landed on the island and claimed it under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. Isn't it the school? I think that's the school. With their tribe. In 1964, there were few people around in the Indian community willing to risk a prison sentence to demonstrate a legal technicality, so the invasion sputtered and died. For the record, the first Indian invasion of Alcatraz was led by Allen Cottier, Dick McKenzie, and Adam Nordwall. I just want to say, historically speaking, and knowing what the Bible and the contribution of actual names can do to its historical relevance, that's a great reason to introduce names. The years passed and the people always kept a wary eye on the island. Adam Nordwell in particular figured that given sufficient manpower and favorable press, a successful invasion would be pulled off. As early as the winter of 1969, plans had been made secretly in the Bay Area to land on the island and reverse the doctrine of discovery in favor of the Indians. But still lacking was that certain spark to bind the different Bay Area groups together as a feasible force. As October ended, a large convention of Indian groups met in San Francisco to form a national organization for Indians living in urban areas throughout the country. The night after the convention disappeared, the Indian Center caught fire and burned completely after the convention dispersed. It was a singularly tragic event for San Francisco's Indian population, which had laboriously built its center over 2 decades. The center formed the focus of community life for Indians living in the area. Suddenly, they were without a meeting place, lacked the social services that their programs had provided, and had practically no way to begin again. And that is against constitutional rights. That we should be able to, it's our constitutional right to meet. The stage was set for the invasion on November 9th, a little more than a week after San Francisco Indian Center had burned. A small contingent of Indians landed on the island and spent several exciting hours being chased by the watchmen who had been hired to keep people away from the abandoned prison island. Not the least discouraged when they were taken ashore the next morning, the Indian invaders, mostly college students from Berkeley and San Francisco State College, reorganized and 10 days later landed some 200 Indian people on the rocks, securing it for a period of 18 months. The story of Alcatraz deserves a book in itself. The numerous details of life on the rock and the parade of personalities involved in the Alcatraz occupation are not as important as the original intent of the Indians who occupied the rock. Upon laying claim to the island, these people issued the proclamation explaining why they had come. They visualized Alcatraz as a spiritual center where people of various tribes could come to learn the traditions and religions of the different tribes from resident spiritual leaders. The intent of the Alcatraz Indians was not to set up a total community on the former prison island that would redeem it from its tragic past. An ecological center to replace the barren and rusted prison cell block was conceived. The sacred plants of all tribes could be grown there and used in healing ceremonies. The Indian University was also advocated. It would be a place where history would not be interrupted so as to justify a program of systematically extinguishing the country's original inhabitants, but rather a place where a true history of the interrelationships of various cultures would be created. A job training center and one for Indian artists and craftsmen was planned. The latter would help pay the overhead for the operation of the whole community. This was the broad scope of the dreaming young college students who landed on Alcatraz. The Alcatraz invasion was hardly a quarrel over land titles or a clever stroke of publicity. It became, of course, a shuttlecock batted about among government agencies, all of which vied for the inside track in case the administration should decide to give the island to the Indians. Rather, it was an effort, albeit premature, to establish a totally Indian community for emphasizing the inherent strengths of the respective tribal communities across the nation. They had a thesis statement. As the government failed to understand it and as the population became more migrant and fluctuated greatly, the original goals of the movement were abandoned and the vision died. The media caught the spirit of the Alcatraz invasion promptly, making it an international cause. Movie stars flocked to the Rock to be seen with Indian college students. Motion picture makers drooled at the opportunity to do a contemporary Indian picture featuring the Rock. Almost every Indian who had touched the Rock was offered a chance to write a book describing the capture of America's most famous and infamous prison. The media unfortunately tended to emphasize the physical exploits of the invaders and failed to investigate the Indians' ultimate intentions of setting up a spiritual center. By the time that things had settled down and constructive proposals had been advanced for the use of the island, every politician had exploited the issue for his own use, and the activists were landing on other surplus government lands, hoping for the same media attention. The media, however, was already shifting to women's lib. When the media no longer glamorized the Alcatraz Indians, no one cared anymore. The government swooped in and took the survivors off the Rock with no incident. Alcatraz was regarded as the symbolic quest of American Indians for a permanent homeland and freedom. Many stories humorously pointed out the similarity of the island to existing reservations. No water, no jobs, no houses, no education facilities, and so forth. In the minds of many Indians, the island came to symbolize the need of American Indians to regain the continent, if not in fact, at least in spirit. It still remains as a singularly beautiful experience for those people who managed to get there. Alcatraz set the pattern for many of the subsequent incidents in the Indian movement, but the corresponding drive to identify a central issue seemed to lapse. In the months that followed the Alcatraz invasion, the Pitt River Indians attempted to reclaim their ancestral lands in Northern California. Through a series of rather shady transfers, their land had come into the possession of some of California's large corporations. The Pitt River tribe had asked to be specifically exempted from the California claims case so as to pursue its own just claims and legislation against the corporations and government agencies that were denying them lands not yet legally taken from them by the government. Its case is still pending. The Indians in the Seattle area looked askance at the proposed closing of part of Fort Lawton, an army post in northwestern area of the city. Under an old statute, abandoned army posts were supposed to be used for Indian education, and so the city's urban Indians in need of a center and training programs asked for the surplus acreage at Fort Lawton for their use. The city promptly asked for the land for another park. Seattle already had so many parks, it was running a deficit every year, and the battle was on. And by the way, government is whatever responsible, although I'm saying constitutionally or whatever, commanded to pay for those parks once that's memorabilia, whatever the hell you want to call it, you have to pay for that. All right, I'm getting on. Jane Fonda had come to Seattle to work against the Vietnam War and found a place for herself in the invasion of Fort Lawton. She received a great deal of criticism for her activities, but one thing is fairly certain. Jane was able to focus the attention on the press, on the event, and the television stations came out in force, thus dampening the intentions of the soldiers and city police to use extreme measures against the Indians. Again, invasions now appeared to come from every direction. Iroquois protesters landed on Stanley Island, which formed part of the St. Regis Mohawk Reserve. The island extended a short distance into the St. Lawrence River and had been leased by the government in 1900 to an American citizen for the magnificent sum of $6. Lots on the island were worth upward of $20,000 for use as summer cottages, make the annual rental of $6 look like an excellent investment to the Yankee realtor. Part of the controversy revolved around the interruption of the Iroquois status in their relationship with the United States, Great Britain, and Canada. The Iroquois had signed a treaty with Great Britain before the invasion of French Canada during the French Indian Wars, which ended in 1763 with the removal of French military power from the North American continent. The Iroquois thus maintained that they were joint conquerors of Canada and deserved to be regarded as co-owners. The Iroquois legal position is probably correct, but the separation of Canada from Great Britain by North America Act of 1867 was so tangled, the legal relationship, that the United States and Canada have been able to take the position that the Iroquois have no international status without any foreign nation objecting to this interpretation of the facts. Almost inextricably intertwined with the legal problems was the fact that certain scholars had arranged in 1909 for the confiscation of the Iroquois wampum belts from the Onondagas as part of a drive to build up the collections in the museum at Albany. The wampums recorded the sacred and political history of the League of the Iroquois, thus giving silent testimony to the status of the Iroquois as originally defined in the relationship with Great Britain. The wampum belts were kept in Albany in a vault, although the anthropologist at the State Museum painted vivid pictures of little school children filing by the display cases by the millions every day, learning about the history of New York State. The belts, however, were keenly missed by the Iroquois in dealing with Canadian officials and trying to recount their struggle with the French and English centuries earlier. The Iroquois were fighting not only for their lands and treaty rights, but for their religious belts, which would complete their reintegration of their league on its traditional basis. It became impossible to separate the different struggles in the East so as to solve any of them. After a two-year fight, the state of New York passed a law allowing the Iroquois to reclaim 5 of the minor belts, not those that both the Iroquois and scholars considered important. And thus it went rocketing from coast to coast. The Indian movement covered a variety of topics in obscure and nameless places during 1970. For example, in June, the big explosion was the attempt of the Pitt River Indians to reclaim their lands once again from the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, led by Mickey Gammill and Richard Oakes, who had commanded the Alcatraz occupation through its first crucial months. A task force of Indians occupied the lands near Big Bend, California. Again, the issue is twofold. The lands had been illegally taken from the Indians without any due process guaranteed them by the federal Constitution. The Indians had been excluded from the California claims case on the grounds that they had separate and identifiable claims to particular lands, and the religious community question was ever present. The Pitt River Indians wanted lands to reconstitute their tribal life, including reestablishment of their tribal religion, which depended on their particular location near Mount Shasta. The Indians were arrested and tried for trespass, but like the original Mohawk controversy at the bridge, were acquitted. The summer of 1970 saw the movement overflow its channel and expanded into almost every state where any significant number of Indians lived. In almost every case, an immediate and identifiable injustice with respect to confiscation of Indian lands was the issue. The Indians of Chicago established an Indian village as a protest against housing discrimination in the city, pointing out that they had been forced into the cities because their lands had been taken by the government. The American Indian movement occupied the dormitories of Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, as a protest against the lethargy of the churches in assisting Indians. AIM, AIM, American Indian Movement, had earlier been to a meeting of the National Council of Churches with no visible effect. As AIM chapters became active, the movement spread to cities with federal surplus property. A lighthouse was seized in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Federal property in Milwaukee was invaded to bring about the establishment of a school. USAF property in Minneapolis was seized by the home chapter of the American Indian Movement. As the final hearings on the passage of the Blue Lake Restoration Bill were being heard in the nation's capital, in Wisconsin, the DRUMS, D-R-U-M-S, organization, fiercely anti-terminationist Menominee seeking repeal of their termination law of almost a decade ago, began a series of demonstrations to save their lakelands. The Tuscaroras, Western members of the Iroquois League, drove a group of whites from their reservation where they had been living in a trailer park. The summer ended in spectacular fashion with the demonstration of Sheep Mountain in the Badlands of South Dakota and a capture of Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills. The protest involved restoration of Indian lands taken from the Oglala Sioux during the Second World War for target practice and never returned. The first phase of the Indian movement spent itself as tendency of activists to make claims on federal lands ebbed. It was apparent that the American public would not support a general policy of restoration of tribal lands. As the national political conventions in 1972, the Indian delegates pushed through amendments to both platforms advocating return of federal surplus lands to tribes, but the amendments were hardly understood by the delegates. They received approval primarily because, as David Brinkley was heard to remark, they do love Indians. That is the end of chapter 1. Oh, yes! Is that good stuff or what? A pile of good stuff. We will start chapter 2. I think it's appropriate to do chapter 2 on day 200 of the classroom. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room. It is May 28th. Still a little dark and gloomy out there, but you know what? I just got through the first chapter by Vinny Deloria. I'm sorry, your whole name should sound like your first name is fine. Deloria? Other than the junior, who would know? God is red. Thanks for this book.